AITA for leaving my partner at home because his OCD made me late to a dinner party at a restaurant. My partner and I have been together for 5 years, and for the most part, we have had a great relationship. We support each other, we laugh together, and we generally understand one another's quirks and habits. But over the past year, things have gotten harder. My partner has obsessive-compulsive disorder, OCD, and while he has always had some rituals and routines, they were manageable before. If anything, I used to think of them as part of who he was, a little endearing, even. But now, they have started to take over, and I am not sure how to handle it anymore. It started with little things. For example, he would double-check that the stove was turned off before we left the house. Perfectly reasonable, right? We all do that sometimes. But then it became checking the stove multiple times, once, twice, 3 times, before we could even walk out the door. He would check the locks, then the windows, then the stove again, just in case. Over time, his checks became longer and more elaborate. It was no longer just physical checks, he started adding mental ones too. He would pause and visibly run through something in his mind, like a script he had to get right, or else he would have to start all over. At first, I tried to be supportive. I mean, I love him, and I know this is not something he chooses to do. It is anxiety-driven, and I wanted to be patient. I would wait while he went through his checks, even when it made us a little late for dinner with friends or to catch a movie. But as the months went on, it became harder to ignore how much this was impacting us. His checks started taking longer, 10 minutes, 15, then 20 or 30. And the rules became stricter. If I accidentally interrupted him by asking if he was ready or even just saying, "We're going to be late," he would get upset. Interrupting him meant he had to start over from the beginning, and that only added more time to the process. I gently suggested he might want to talk to someone about it. Therapy, I thought, could really help. I even offered to help him find a therapist or go with him if he wanted support. But every time I brought it up, he would shut it down. He insisted he could manage it on his own, that he just needed time to get it under control. He was adamant that he did not need outside help, and I didn't want to push him too hard. Still, it was getting worse, and I was starting to feel the strain. The breaking point came 2 weeks ago. My boss had invited me and several co-workers to a dinner party at a nice restaurant to celebrate my recent promotion. This was a big deal for me, not just because it was a chance to celebrate, but because I wanted to make a good impression. My boss is the kind of person who values punctuality and professionalism, and I knew this dinner was an opportunity to show that I was deserving of the new role. I was excited, but also nervous, because I knew how long my partner's checks could take. I asked him to start getting ready 2 hours before we needed to leave. 2 hours. I figured that would be more than enough time for him to do his checks and for us to leave on time. I even planned for us to leave a little earlier than necessary, just in case. He agreed, and I thought everything would be fine. But as the clock ticked closer to our departure time, I could feel my anxiety growing. He was still in the middle of his routine, pacing between the kitchen, the front door, and the windows, muttering to himself under his breath. I couldn't say anything to him, because if I did, he would have to start over. I sat there in silence, watching the minutes slip away, feeling helpless and frustrated. When we were supposed to leave, he was still checking. I tried to stay calm, but inside, I was panicking. This was not just a casual dinner with friends, this was an important event for my career. 5 minutes passed. Then 10. I could feel the knot in my stomach tightening. Finally, I said, "I'm sorry, but I can't wait any longer. I have to go." He looked up at me, shocked. "You're leaving without me?" "I don't want to," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "But we're already late, and I can't be any later for this. It's really important to me." He didn't say anything, but the look on his face was a mix of hurt and anger. I grabbed my keys and left, my heart pounding. I felt terrible, but I also felt like I didn't have a choice. I drove to the restaurant, trying to calm myself down and rehearse an excuse for being late. I ended up being 5 minutes late, which was not a big deal, everyone just assumed it was traffic, and no one seemed to care. The dinner went well, and my boss was in a great mood, but I couldn't fully relax because I knew what was waiting for me at home. When I got back, my partner barely looked at me. He was furious. He said I had been insensitive and selfish, that I should have waited for him, no matter what. I tried to explain that I couldn't risk being late for something so important, but he would not hear it. He accused me of not supporting him, of not understanding how hard this was for him. And maybe he is right. Maybe I don't understand. But it feels like his OCD is affecting both of us, and I don't know what to do anymore. It has been 2 weeks, and he is still upset. He barely talks to me, and when he does, it is tense and cold. I hate that I hurt him, but I also hate that this has become such a problem in our relationship. I want to be there for him, but how can I do that when he refuses to get help? I feel stuck between supporting him and standing up for my own needs, and I am not sure if I handled this the right way. So, AITA for leaving him at home that night? Or was I right to prioritize something that mattered so much to me? I feel like I am walking a tightrope, and I do not know how to keep my balance anymore. Update 1. After 2 weeks of strained silence, tense conversations, and the constant feeling of walking on eggshells, I realized I couldn't keep going like this. The atmosphere in our home had become suffocating. It was as though the warmth and ease we used to share had been replaced by something heavy and oppressive, a weight neither of us could put down. Every interaction felt fraught with unspoken resentment, an invisible wall growing higher between us with every passing day. Even the smallest gestures, passing him a coffee mug in the morning or brushing by him in the hallway, seemed loaded with tension, as though one wrong word or glance could shatter the fragile equilibrium we were barely maintaining. I hated it. I hated how distant we had become, how something that had once felt so solid now felt precarious and fragile. I hated the constant unease, the feeling of tiptoeing around each other like strangers who didn't know how to reconnect. I hated how we had ended up here, trapped in this cycle of tension and avoidance that neither of us seemed willing or able to break. And most of all, I hated how powerless I felt to fix it. I kept replaying the past months in my mind, trying to pinpoint the exact moment when things had gone from difficult to unbearable, but it wasn't one moment. It was a slow, creeping erosion, a series of small fractures that had grown into a chasm. One evening, after dinner, I knew I couldn't keep quiet any longer. The silence between us as we ate had been deafening, each bite of food feeling like an insurmountable effort, and I felt the knot in my chest tighten with every passing minute. I mustered every ounce of courage I had and told myself it was now or never. I had to say what had been weighing on me for weeks, even if it scared me. Even if it hurt him. Even if it changed everything. I sat him down on the couch and started with what I thought was the most important thing to say, that I loved him. Because I do. Despite everything, I love him deeply, and I needed him to know that before I said anything else. I told him that his OCD wasn't something he had chosen, that I understood it wasn't his fault, and that my frustration wasn't with him as a person but with the way his OCD had started to consume our lives. I tried to be as gentle as I could, but I didn't shy away from the truth. His OCD wasn't just affecting him anymore. It was affecting me, our relationship, and the life we had worked so hard to build together. I told him that I wanted to support him, but that I couldn't keep pretending everything was fine when it clearly wasn't. As I spoke, I could feel the weight of my words in the room, heavy and inescapable. I could see the flicker of defensiveness in his eyes, the way his jaw tightened and his shoulders tensed. At first, his reaction was exactly what I had feared. He insisted, as he always had, that he didn't need help, that he could manage his OCD on his own if I just gave him more time. It was the same refrain I had heard over and over, and I wanted to believe him, I really did. But the past year had shown me that this wasn't something he could manage on his own, no matter how much he wanted to. The rituals were getting worse, not better, and they were taking both of us down with them. I hesitated, feeling the weight of what I was about to say next. My heart was pounding, and my hands were trembling slightly as I forced myself to meet his gaze. This was the hardest thing I had ever said to him, but I knew it was the truth, and I couldn't keep hiding from it. I don't think I can stay in this relationship if you're not willing to take steps to improve things, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. I can't keep feeling like I'm losing myself in this. The words felt like a dam breaking, releasing all the emotions I had been holding back for months. They hung in the air like a storm cloud, dark and ominous, and for a moment, I thought I had pushed him too far. He didn't say anything at first, just stared at the floor, his expression a tangled mix of anger, sadness, and something else I couldn't quite place. I braced myself for the worst, convinced I had just crossed a line we wouldn't be able to come back from. But then, to my surprise, he sighed, a deep, weary sigh that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside him, and said quietly, "Okay. I'll try therapy." The relief that washed over me in that moment was almost overwhelming. It was as though a massive weight I hadn't even realized I was carrying had been lifted from my shoulders. I wanted to cry, to hug him, to thank him for agreeing to take this step. But I also knew this was just the beginning. Agreeing to therapy was one thing, following through and committing to the hard, uncomfortable work of confronting his OCD would be another. Still, it was a start. For the first time in months, I felt a flicker of hope, a tiny light breaking through the darkness that had been hanging over us. The next few days felt like a cautious truce. We spent hours researching therapists together, combing through reviews and directories to find someone who specialized in OCD and anxiety disorders. I offered to make the calls, but he wanted to handle it himself, which I took as a good sign. He found a therapist who seemed like a good fit and scheduled his first appointment for the following week. I could tell he was nervous. He didn't say much about it, but the way he fidgeted and avoided eye contact whenever the subject came up spoke volumes. Still, he didn't back out, and that alone felt like a small victory. The night before his session, though, he came to me with a request that caught me off guard. He told me he would go to therapy, but he needed to know I was fully committed to understanding what he was going through. He wanted me to listen to everything he shared after each session so I could see things from his perspective, not just my own. At first, I wasn't sure how to respond. I wanted to support him, of course, but I also knew this journey needed to be about him and his willingness to confront his OCD, not about me being his constant sounding board. Still, I could see how much it mattered to him, and I wanted to show him I was in this with him. So I agreed, even though I wasn't entirely sure what I was signing up for. It seemed like a fair request, and for the first time in a long time, it felt like we were on the same team again. Update 2. Underscore 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 underscore. After just a few therapy sessions, my partner began to open up about the roots of his OCD in ways I had never anticipated. One evening, he came home with an air of quiet reflection, his usual tension softened into something more contemplative. I could tell from the way he lingered near me, fidgeting with his hands and glancing at me every so often, that he had something on his mind. Finally, he sat me down, his face a mixture of vulnerability and determination. What he told me in the next hour unraveled so many of the mysteries I had struggled to understand over the years. He explained that his OCD wasn't something he had always lived with, not in the form it took now, anyway. He traced it back to his first full-time job, a position he had taken fresh out of college, eager to prove himself in the world. At first, it had seemed like a dream opportunity, a well-paying role in a respected company, with the promise of career growth. But that dream had quickly turned into a nightmare. His manager, he said, had been relentless. Nothing he did was ever good enough. Every task, no matter how small, was picked apart under a microscope. The manager would point out tiny, inconsequential errors with a tone that made them feel monumental, as though each one was a catastrophic failure. The constant scrutiny created a pressure cooker of anxiety. My partner found himself double and triple checking his work, not out of pride or diligence, but out of a deep-seated fear of being berated. He would pore over reports for hours, agonizing over every detail, terrified of missing something that might earn him another scathing critique. This wasn't just about professional growth or meeting expectations, it was about survival in an environment that punished imperfection. Every task became a minefield, and he had no choice but to tread carefully. Over time, that fear seeped into other areas of his life. It wasn't just about the reports anymore. It was whether he had locked the office door properly at the end of the day or whether his emails were worded just right. He started staying late at work, obsessively checking everything he had done throughout the day. And then, when he finally did leave, he would sometimes drive back to the office to check again, just in case. The fear of forgetting something, of making a mistake, became paralyzing. Eventually, he left that job. The stress and toxicity had become too much, and he couldn't take it anymore. On the surface, leaving seemed like the solution. He thought that by walking away from the environment that had caused his anxiety, he could leave the anxiety itself behind. But as he spoke that evening, it became clear that this hadn't been the case. The habits he had developed to cope with that pressure, the constant checking, the perfectionism, the rituals, had followed him, embedding themselves into his everyday life. Even after he started a new job in a healthier environment, the patterns persisted. He couldn't shake the belief that if he didn't check and recheck everything, something terrible would happen. It was no longer about an angry manager or a toxic workplace, it was about a nameless, shapeless dread that he couldn't quite explain. The rituals gave him a sense of control, a way to quiet the fear, even if only temporarily. And over the years, they had grown more elaborate, more time-consuming, until they began to take over entirely. Listening to him that night, my heart broke in ways I hadn't expected. I had always known he was meticulous, even perfectionistic, but I had never realized how deeply rooted it was in fear and anxiety. It wasn't about wanting things to be right for the sake of it, it was about protecting himself from the overwhelming belief that imperfection equaled catastrophe. I felt a profound sense of sadness, not just for the pain he had endured but for the way it had quietly shaped so much of his life without him even realizing it. I asked him why he had never told me any of this before, why he had carried this burden alone for so long. He admitted, with a vulnerability I rarely saw in him, that he had been afraid I would see him as weak or incapable. He had worked so hard to leave that toxic chapter of his life behind, but it still haunted him in ways he couldn't fully escape. Admitting it out loud, even to himself, had felt like acknowledging that the manager who had torn him down still had power over him, years after the fact. Hearing this shifted something in me. So much of the frustration I had felt, about the endless checks, the delays, the tension in our relationship, suddenly had a new context. It didn't erase the challenges or the toll his OCD had taken on me, but it gave me a window into his experience that I hadn't had before. It wasn't just about control or habit, it was about fear. Fear of failure, fear of judgment, fear of losing the sense of safety he had spent years trying to rebuild. That night, after he went to bed, I stayed up thinking about everything he had shared. I kept coming back to one question: how do you help someone unlearn years of fear and self-doubt? Therapy was a step in the right direction, but the weight of what he was carrying felt monumental. This wasn't just about stopping rituals or breaking habits, it was about challenging a belief system that had become a part of him. It felt daunting, even overwhelming, to think about what it would take to truly move forward. At the same time, I couldn't ignore the impact it had on me. As much as I wanted to be there for him, to support him in this process, I also felt a sense of helplessness. His OCD had become such a dominant force in our lives that I sometimes felt like I was living in its shadow. I didn't want to resent him, I loved him too much for that, but I couldn't deny the toll it had taken on me. Knowing the root of his OCD gave me a new perspective. Update 3. A few months into therapy, my partner's progress was slow but steady. He was still working through the layers of his OCD, unraveling the habits and beliefs that had taken root over the years. Then one day, his therapist introduced an idea that neither of us saw coming. It wasn't about exposure therapy or revisiting the traumas of his past, as we'd both expected. Instead, the therapist proposed something that felt entirely counterintuitive at first, focusing on building new habits, specifically, learning to delegate. The concept was simple in theory but complicated in practice. My partner's OCD was driven by a deep need for control, a belief that if he didn't take responsibility for every detail, something catastrophic would happen. His therapist explained that part of breaking this cycle was teaching his brain that it didn't always have to be him in charge. By allowing someone else to take on a task, even a small one, he could begin to challenge the idea that his vigilance was the only thing keeping disaster at bay. And so, the suggestion was made: start delegating to someone he trusted. Naturally, I was the obvious choice. I could see the hesitation in his eyes when the therapist suggested it. The idea of handing off even a sliver of responsibility to someone else, even me, made him anxious. He confessed later that the thought of relying on anyone else, no matter how much he trusted them, felt like giving up control of his safety net. But to his credit, he agreed to try. He was willing to take the leap, even if it felt like jumping off a cliff. His first test was deceptively simple, letting me lock the doors before bed. It sounded easy enough, but for him, it was monumental. Locking the doors was one of his longest-standing rituals, something he checked and rechecked every night without fail. Letting me take over wasn't just about trusting me, it was about letting go of the belief that his actions were the only thing keeping us safe. That first night, the tension in the air was palpable. I locked the doors, making sure to do it slowly and deliberately so he could see and hear me. Then I announced, "All done," and sat back down, hoping that would be enough to reassure him. But it wasn't. He paced the living room for what felt like an eternity, glancing at the front door every few minutes like it was daring him to test his resolve. His hands fidgeted, his breathing quickened, and I could see the internal battle playing out on his face. He wanted so badly to trust me, to leave it alone, but the urge to check it himself was almost overpowering. He didn't sleep much that night. Neither of us did. I reassured him over and over that everything was fine, that I had locked the doors properly, but his anxiety didn't care. It gnawed at him, whispering doubts that I couldn't silence. Still, he didn't give in. He stayed in bed, restless and exhausted, but he didn't get up to check. It was a small victory, but one that felt enormous. Over the next few weeks, he kept at it. Each night, he let me lock the doors, and though the anxiety didn't disappear overnight, it gradually lessened. The more he saw that nothing bad happened, the more he began to trust that it didn't have to be his responsibility alone. That small step became the foundation for bigger ones. Soon, he started delegating other tasks, letting me double-check that the stove was off, organize the bills, or handle the car keys when we went out. Every new responsibility he handed over felt like a monumental step forward, even if it was something as mundane as making sure the lights were turned off. There were setbacks, of course. Some nights, the anxiety would creep back in, and I could see him teetering on the edge of taking back control. But each time, he pushed through. He would talk himself down or remind himself of the progress he had made, and eventually, the moment would pass. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. The real turning point came not at home, but at work. One day, he told me that his therapist had challenged him to delegate a task to one of his coworkers, something he would normally insist on doing himself. It wasn't a huge project, just a routine report, but for him, the thought of entrusting it to someone else was terrifying. His fear of imperfection and criticism still loomed large, and he worried endlessly about what would happen if the coworker made a mistake. But he did it anyway. He handed over the report, resisted the urge to micromanage, and waited. When the project was completed, it wasn't just fine, it was excellent. His coworker had done a great job, and the team even praised the final product. For the first time, my partner saw tangible proof that things didn't always have to be perfect, or done entirely by him, for them to turn out well. It was a revelation, one that seemed to unlock something in him. Slowly, he began trusting others more, both at work and at home, and the weight he had been carrying alone for so long started to lighten. For our relationship, the impact was transformative. The constant tension that had once defined our days began to dissipate. We found ourselves laughing more, relaxing more, and rediscovering the ease we had shared in the early years of our relationship. He still had his moments. There were times when the old habits would creep back in, and I'd see him staring at the front door or hesitating to delegate something at work. But now, we talked about it. He would tell me what he was feeling, and I would listen, offering support without judgment. It felt like we were finally on the same team again. I won't lie, there are still nights when I think about the dinner party, about how painful that night was for both of us. It's not something I'll ever forget, but in a strange way, I think it was the wake-up call we both needed. It forced us to confront what wasn't working and make the hard choices that ultimately brought us here. Sometimes, love isn't just about patience or kindness, it's about knowing when to push for change, even when it's uncomfortable. It's about being honest, with yourself and with the person you love, about what you need and what you can't live without. I'm proud of how far we've come, and while I know the journey isn't over, I finally feel hopeful about where we're headed.